Hello! Welcome to the short little podcast video discussing queer history. This episode focuses specifically on a figure active in Houston in the 80s and 90s, Marion E. Coleman. Coleman was a very active member of the community, both on her own and as the owner of House of Coleman and Kindred Spirits, and in more professional settings, such as a member of the Log Cabin Republicans, a board member of the Colby Project, and the vice president of the Gay and Lesbian Caucus. Despite a staggering reputation, chances are you've never heard of Coleman. She's featured in historical projects such as the OH Project, a collection of oral histories of specifically people in the Houston and Harris County queer community during the HIV/AIDS epidemic, and the Banner Project, a pop-up exhibit describing various figures in Houston's queer community. However, these are both interest-specific projects. While they are publicly available in the general sense, are absolutely very important, they aren't very well heard of in the community as a whole due to the fact that they're both specific to a single city. This means even for queer Houstonians, it's likely they'll go unheard of because when people first join the community, they tend to focus on the big stuff and leave their learning there. The thing is, as important as those big names in queer history are, they aren't the only ones. The journey of our community wasn't done by 3 or 4 wonderful, amazing people making leaps and bounds, tens of laws at a time. It was made painfully, grinding slowly forward, fighting for every inch. And that constant fighting, constant pushing a little bit further, requires the efforts of absolutely everyone in the community doing their part. Marion Coleman understood this and did her best to do her part. Coleman was born in Massachusetts to a police officer/interior designer father and a librarian mother, surrounded by grandparents she loved through childhood. Despite a rocky start, she survived her birth and continued living in the New England area through graduating high school. After holding various jobs, she met a man named Jim Coleman, and together they moved to Houston, Texas. They entered a platonic marriage in 1957, but Jim passed of cancer soon after in '63. Before he passed, one fateful day playing softball on her team, Coleman made friends with one of the owners of the JBJ Printing Company and ended up joining up with them. While the company did teach her printing, she had to leave it the day before Jim passed, as the FBI had been watching JBJ for counterfeiting. Having gained her printing skills, however, she decided to start her own printing company in 1970, House of Coleman, printing for various nonprofits and organizations both that she was a board member of and not, at discounted prices to help the cause. If she hasn't already proven her tenacity as an individual, the printing scene at the time was, as a majority of fields were, severely dominated by men. She faced the question everywhere she went, what's a woman doing in printing? And was turned away from a few areas. However, as Coleman is wont to do, she found someone who liked her energy and gave her a chance, and from there she was able to get more and more jobs. Furthermore, it's also important to note that she was out as gay throughout her entire time climbing the printing chain. Part of Coleman's tenacity and charm comes from the fact that she was confident in who she was, and reading through her history, it's clear it never led her astray. Now, in 1976, she begins to involve herself more directly in the queer community. Her grandparents had passed down their interest in politics, so when her friend Gary Van Utengem asked her to be his vice president in leading the gay political caucus, she couldn't say no. Utengem himself had been fired from his job the year prior for coming out as gay. His job wanted him to sign a document refraining from any participation in politics during business hours, something in itself a gray area and up to the judgment of people who would likely be prejudiced against him. And when he refused, he was fired. This event sparked the interest of some queer Houstonians who were already planning to start the caucus, so they asked him to lead it. A few years before the HIV/AIDS epidemic began, queer issues weren't nearly as large in the news as they would become. Despite this, the community still faced discrimination, so the caucus was formed with the express goal of electing candidates who supported gay rights and made commitments to the gay community in Houston. Having been in Houston for over a decade now, she had a well-established sense of community and plenty of connections. One such connection came to her at her House of Coleman and asked for her help. Already on the board of a nonprofit together, Coleman's friend asked if she would join her as a board member of a counseling center. Coleman agreed and added the later named Montrose Counseling Center to her long and growing list of board positions. The trend continued because of the fact that she was a woman, out, and owned a business. In the patriarchal and heteronormative society of the time, she was an inspiration to those around her, so anything that featured her had a solid boost to its chances of success. A customer at the bar and friend of Coleman, Nancy Ford, wrote in 2007 how, upon the opening of the bar, there were hundreds of lesbians present and having a wonderful time. Throughout its time opened, it hosted various events, both for fun and fundraising, ranging from drag shows to music to whatever the community desired. Ford described winning one of the music contests with her guitar and being rewarded with her first professional music gig. Another benefit of attending KS for Ford was meeting her girlfriend at trivia night. In recalling this memory, Ford brings up a really important point about the role of queer spaces in queer lives. She stated how back in the 80s there were very few places for gay people to simply exist, something that still is true today. And knowing how valued the growing number of queer bookstores, cafes, and the like are today, these emotions can be used to understand how important it was back then that Coleman met the demand for a more open, welcoming space than already existed. A place where both men and women were welcome not just on paper, but in practice too. Her goal to provide help wherever it was needed was harshly put to the test in 1981 when the first few cases of HIV were reported. Although the epidemic started off slower at first, it grew exponentially and rocked queer communities everywhere. Houston was no exception. As many of Coleman's friends got sick around her, the stigma began to explode as well. At the time the epidemic began, due to the fact that HIV/AIDS was dealt with almost exclusively in the gay and addict communities, the government put little funding towards researching it. The lack of medical information led to an explosion of stigma. People thought that it was viral, and many refused to be around gay men at all. Coleman had to hire male staff at KS because her gay women quit for fear of becoming infected. Through all of this, Marion E. Coleman's strength of character carried her on. Balancing business, funerals of friends, and activism, Coleman, alongside some other friends, started volunteering however she could to help AIDS victims. One of the first things she did was, as part of the Executive Professional Association of Houston, EPA, start going to hospitals and help victims with whatever they may need. At first, she and Newton would simply go visit patients and let them talk. Hospitals were lonely, especially with the stigma and prejudice against gay men, so having a caring and listening ear meant a great deal for many. It quickly evolved, though. Many HIV/AIDS patients were bedridden, so Coleman would go home to water plants, feed pets, and throw away things like drug stashes if requested. She even helped a gay man estranged from his family reconnect with his mother before dying by giving his mother rides to the hospital without the homophobic father knowing. It was at this point Coleman got serious about using everything at her disposal to help the cause. Using House of Coleman, she printed memorial flyers using only the finest paper and ink and completely free of charge, as was her style, for the dying. Additionally, partnering kindred spirits with other bars in the area, she and others would host every manner of fundraising activity. They worked on bake sales, drag shows, casino nights, even going as far as to put on plays. During this time, a bar patron and nurse reached out to Coleman about doing a blood drive. The Red Cross wouldn't allow any done at gay men's bars, so Coleman happily joined on, raising around 600 pints of blood before the Red Cross realized who they were and cut them off. The issue with gay men donating blood brought to light for Coleman and her community in these events furthered Coleman's commitment to the cause, as well as taught women around her just how valuable they were. They would ask Coleman constantly about when the next fundraiser was, what they could do, anything to help, and Coleman took the reins in directing anyone who wanted to help anywhere that needed them, sending them to different hospitalized men who needed babysitting or errands run. One of the reasons this section is so essential is due to the divide that existed between gay men and lesbians prior to the AIDS epidemic. As aforementioned, a great deal of misogyny existed in the queer community. Gay men were leading protests and marches, giving speeches, being represented in the news and media, and lesbians were left in the dust, only really allowed to help by filling space. All of this changed with the AIDS epidemic. Gay men were being hospitalized left and right. Many of their friends and families, both outside and in the gay community, wouldn't come to see them or help in any way because of prejudice or stigma. Lesbian realized how dire the situation was for gay men and put aside their feelings about the discrimination to come in and help in any way possible, and so gay and lesbian solidarity began. There would be one or two lesbians per gay man, and they would do anything they could to help him recover or settle his situation before passing, if necessary. They would be the primary blood donor for that man. They'd take care of any part of his life needed, as aforementioned, let it be child, pet, or house care, running errands, getting medicine, anything. This is the reason that the L in LGBTQ comes first. It's a thank you to the insane amount of help that lesbians offer gay men in a time so dire. And Coleman was at the center of it in Houston. Despite the increasing divide between a cis-heteronormative common society and the gay community, increasing crime rates against gay folks for simply being gay, Coleman openly and loudly put herself out there as the person to come to in order to help in one way or another. And that isn't to say Coleman didn't feel consequence for it. Despite all the women who were willing to help, a great deal were still instilled with that stigma and refused to come to KS as long as any gay men were working. But, for all the clientele they lost, the gains they made in the realm of friendly, open, and loving faces was much greater. And to grow that community, Coleman used KS to sponsor pool and softball teams to tell people about the bar. The pool team went from bar to bar, both men's and women's, and when all was said and done, Coleman had yet another achievement under her belt in the realm of bringing gay men and women closer together. As the disease spread to the straight majority of people, the government began taking it more seriously. Medicines and educational programs were developed, everything. New case rates were lowered, and life expectancies grew. Despite KS closing in 1989, Coleman continued to be a queer activist, both specifically pertaining to AIDS as well as in general. She participated on the boards of various organizations such as Design Industries Foundation Fighting AIDS, abbreviated as DIFA, Body Positive, the Log Cabin Republicans, the Houston Council of Human Rights, among many others, as well as continuing to fundraise, make donations, and volunteer. Throughout participation in these groups, she would continue to use the House of Coleman to provide whatever paper was necessary to spread their message and any information. She also established the Kindred Spirits Foundation to raise money for various nonprofits, as well as direct those donations. Outside of the Houston LGBT History Archives, there isn't much information on Coleman's activities, meaning past 1999, there isn't any information about her. The interview she did with the OH Project was done in 2016, so as best as the internet shows, she's alive and doing well. Marion E. Coleman was the activist a great deal of the queer community today should aspire to be. Throughout her life, whether big or small, though for her more often big, she was involved in the community around her and working hard to make it better. Whether it was as simple as giving her opinion and having her voice heard, or as grand as orchestrating the assistance of hundreds of gay men stricken with AIDS, she put her heart and soul into loving everyone who walked through any of the doors of her businesses and making the world a better place, no matter what the odds seemed.